first few slides, we are going to recap to make sure we understand all the issues at site, the issues with the making of the lake, the vision that has driven it, and the kind of challenges that we have on the site. So to begin with, this is the situation where we are seeing the test lake to one side of the Matrimandir as it stands. I'm going to also keep annotating it just to make sure that we are all on the same page. This is the where the test lake has been dug up. This is the Matrimandir site. This is the amphitheater and the banyan tree here. So the primary conditions that we need to look for and understand is that there is a level difference on the site, which is the high point of 54 meters on this side to a low point of 50 meters, which is approximately 3.6 meters level difference. Now, very quickly moving to the hang on, there is, yeah. The concept development process, we are going to run through this very briefly, where we are starting with the idea of the circular progression of space as described by the mother to invoke the various states of consciousness. And when we look at some of the criteria that had been put in place, for example, that the width of the lake should be approximately 100 meters. We are working with two numbers here, and the rationale for these two numbers will become apparent as we go along. One is the maximum desirable width of 100 meters and a minimum workable width of 30 meters, so that the idea of the Matrimandir situated on the island is not lost. Now, there are some key visual and physical considerations that also determines how this lake will be developed. One is the set of the three cardinal points, the north, south, and the west being the primary axis that leads us towards the Matrimandir. Though the eastern axis, the cardinal point does exist, this is not meant for physical access into the island. Now, in addition to this, there are also very key locations on the outer periphery that we see, where one is able to glimpse at the Matrimandir, either between the banyan trees to the background or across the amphitheater and so on. So these visual axes also become equally critical. Yeah. Now, there is the ridge line on which the Matrimandir is sitting, which is the outer line of the island. And the outer edge of the lake also is conceived as something that fluctuates in time and space. It's not seen as a fixed line that is drawn on the ground, but something that responds to the ebbs and flows of the seasons across the year. Now, the idea of the lake is twofold. One can imagine that the sense of water is seen as a barrier, or that it is seen as a threshold, both of which will actually be very important from our design considerations. The idea of a threshold is that it allows a gradual progression towards the Matrimandir, and the idea of the barrier is that it also helps segregate the sacred and the profane within the larger landscape of Auroville. Now, when we look at the cross section, the bottom right hand, the little image that you see is indicative of the place where we have taken the section. The section is looking southwards, with the Matrimandir to the center and the outer gardens towards the left, as we see in the cross section. So the cross section actually moves through the outer gardens, the lake, the inner gardens, the Matrimandir, the banyan tree, and then the amphitheater in one long sequence. So the idea is that how does one capture this relationship, this sequence of relationship of spaces that is spanning across the landscape, even in the way the edges of the lakes are designed. If we were to shift the angle of the section slightly, where the difference you will notice between this first section is that the outer gardens are at a much higher level as compared to this section where the outer gardens are at a much lower level. The relative position and the levels of the lake and the Matrimandir remains unchanged at this point. But the idea is that one is able to create a sequence of open spaces, both in the outer as well as in the inner gardens, that helps connect with the main Matrimandir to the visitors. Moving further along the same cross section, when the cross section actually moves across the banyan tree and the amphitheater, what is also important is that the varying width of the lake gives rise to the potential of creating several islands. Now, these islands are not only aesthetic, definitely they have a very, very high aesthetic value, but also they are a response to the condition of the lake, the existing vegetation patterns, and to ensure that we create a sustainable ecology across the entire system. And in each of these cases, the margins or the interface of the land and the water changes continuously from being a vertical surface to something that is gradually merging from the lower to the upper levels. So the next 4-5 slides, we will look at the different design iterations that we undertook. For example, to understand which would need to be the widest points of the lake to enhance the idea of an island, because you need a certain minimum visual mass for the water for the idea of the island to be established more firmly. And equally important is the idea of movement, because we are not thinking of this as a static element, but something that is experienced as one moves across the outer gardens with the Matrimandir towards our center. As one moves from the eastern to the western edge, the edges of the lake, if you see the difference between as the progression happens here, the western edge starts becoming increasingly organic, a lot more natural and tranquil in the kind of spaces that are getting created. Also, because of the prevalence of the existing mature vegetation in this area, the profile of the lake responds to this accordingly. And like I mentioned in the first slide, the crossover points remains along the 3 cardinal points, north, south, and west, and nothing on the eastern side. So it's also important to understand the existing tracts of vegetation. Of course, all of you are aware of the immense changes this space has seen, especially in the last couple of years. This is based on all the mapping that has been done by Julio and Jan and others, which gives us a fairly precise idea of the kind of vegetation that still exists after all the denudation and the destruction has happened. Now, this mapping of the existing vegetation has become crucial because we want to make sure that not a single one of these mature vegetation is disturbed in any way in our attempt to create the lake. So we want to maximize the few existing vegetation tracts. So the other larger idea that we are working with. As you will notice, towards the east is from where the main watershed flows of the city happens, moving towards the Matrimandir. And the idea is that the many different expressions of water, not just in different seasons, but also as different spaces, where in some cases it is more fast and turbulent, and in some other cases it is more placid and reflective. So the different qualities of water actually is reflective of the different avatars of water that we see that takes shape across this landscape. And moving from the east, as we move towards the western edges, the quality of the water tends to become larger, more placid, more reflective, and increasingly more natural as it meets the existing vegetation patches towards the western edge, which, by the way, is also the main point of physical access into the inner island. Now, one fairly important thing that we will need to understand at this stage is the fact that there is a level difference across the land when we are looking at Matrimandir in the center and looking at not just the inner and outer gardens, but the larger space, which means that the lake should not be seen and understood as a static water body of one fixed level. There are two kinds of level variations that happen. One is the change that happens because of the topography, where the eastern edges are higher as compared to the west. And the second level variation that happens is because of the seasons. We want to ensure that the lake is responsive to the natural climate, which means that during the monsoon, post-monsoon, maybe after a heavy cyclonic event, we have a higher volume of water as compared to the summer where it will be lower. At no point will it be fully dry, but it will be responsive to the different qualities of wetness that one comes to expect pre and post monsoon in Auroville. Now, based on these things, these considerations, what we start seeing is that the inner island remains as one single firm shape defined by the inner gardens and all the existing features of the Matrimandir, the amphitheater, and the banyan tree, whereas the outer gardens responds continuously to the changing profiles of the lake. The western edge is clearly the most challenging one, because it is allowing us physical access to the Matrimandir, but it is also ecologically the most sensitive, because this is the place that has the maximum incidence of existing vegetation. So the concept of islands that accommodates, and not just accommodates, actually celebrates these vegetation, these mature trees, becomes a signature element through which one will traverse before entering into the inner gardens. So the final proposal that we are looking at, where you will see there is a firm line of the inner garden, which is defined with a very specific geometry that also integrates the 12 petals gardens that was originally conceived for the Matrimandir area. There are two secondary axes, one on the north and one on the south, that allows access into the Matrimandir. Again, this will not be a large causeway, because we're very mindful of the fact that we do not want very dominant engineering structures to come in as bridges, but something that's a lot more subtle, that will allow us to hop across different points, literally as the islands being seen as stepping stones that one would use to access the main Matrimandir. while the main entrance happens from the western side. Again, the idea of the bridge is still very important. Otherwise, to have a very large defined lake space is very, very difficult to achieve. However, again, to keep the idea of the bridge as subtle and as low key as possible, it will be seen as a series of stepping stones that will traverse through the islands, reaching into the inner gardens. Now, dimensionally, you will notice on this drawing that there are a few points where we have stretched the lake to the maximum extent that is possible, to 100 meters. Whereas in many other cases, either the lake edge itself shrinks inwards or is articulated through a series of islands. So you do not see a static 100-meter band around the Matrimandir as one single water body, but something that moves as a response to the topography in the case of levels, or in the vegetation in the case of existing vegetation. So the maximum width, I repeat, will be kept at 100 meters with the inner edge as a defined geometry, whereas the outer edge has a variable profile. The presence of the islands actually become very, very important. Like I mentioned, they have several functions. They also have a hydrological function to ensure that the movement of water does not erode the banks or the bed of the lake. They also create very, very valuable habitats for marine and insect and bird life. They also help cater to the existing vegetation and integrating them without the need for removing extra vegetation. And fourth is the physical expression, where the islands then become stepping stones. So rather than see the idea of water as a barrier, the islands actually helps render it to create a series of thresholds that allows one to approach the inner island gradually. The next few slides, we will run through this very fast. Of course, after this meeting, I will be sharing this final presentation with you, Jan and Suhasni. So please share it with the community, because there's a whole lot of detailing that has gone into it. I'm not sure if we will have enough time to go through each of them, but I will touch upon the main points. The first series of cross sections that we are seeing are where you will notice the diagram on the top right with the arrows, which means that the inner gardens are to the left of the cross section, and we are looking towards the main lake. So it is a combination of the visual experience. It is a means of controlling the ecological edge, because one thing I should have mentioned, which is now is probably a good point, is that we do not want to use any industrial structures to achieve all the things that we're talking about. We will maximize the use of passive technologies as well as natural materials to ensure that both the lake's structural stability as well as the island's behavior, including safe access, are created without the need for industrial structures such as reinforced concrete. So these cross sections, you will see it continuously moves with the inner gardens to our left and the main lake to the right. What you will notice between the two sections here, for example, is that in one case, the land merges very gradually with the water through a series of pebble and boulder driven spaces, whereas in another case, it steps down as a series of water gardens, grasslands, things that will be able to take the variation in the water level without obviating the need for a retaining wall structure. The next section, also moving closer to the entrance, means that these also become physical and experiential spaces, allowing people to actually sit and gaze across the water. And in the same space, we also have the option where the pathways are actually seen as multiple levels, both belonging to the inner garden. The one towards the left is at a higher plane, and the one to the right is closer to the water edge, which also creates different experiences as one traverses the inner gardens. Now, the next set of sections that we are seeing are, as you will see in the key plan to the top right, is a series of cross sections that is showing the outer gardens to the left. Till now, we had the inner gardens to the left and looking to the lake. Now we are standing towards the outer garden and then looking inwards to the lake. Again, the quality of the edges varies fairly substantially depending on the topography. This being the steepest of the areas will have more boulders and rocks populating this space. And as one moves along, can get a more articulated, constructed edge, which gives us a cleaner access to the water. The level of access, you will notice, also varies between the sections, where in some cases you're closer to the surface of water, in some cases you're higher. In some cases, the natural edge is expressed in such a way that the variations in the water level is completely hidden by the water-based planting or the marine creatures that is used to define the edges. The area that also has a lot of the islands gets extended, and the idea of the stepping stone here becomes quite literal and not just metaphorical, where large boulders actually helps us to move and navigate through the water in a limited way. There are also very, very shallow and gentle slopes that allows for a much more informal use of the lake banks. The idea is that one would like to create as many different opportunities and different articulations so that the way one relates to water can vary continuously across this landscape. It's not one static experience that defines the land and the water, and of course the user. It changes continuously across the profile of the lake. And this is the final picture where we are looking at the, going back to repeating what I said in the beginning, the idea of the barrier and the threshold as two different ways of looking at and understanding water. In this case, the notional edge that defines the outer periphery of the lake changes continuously, blending with both the existing features as well as the kind of uses that we foresee once the three axes are in place. If you please notice the key plan to the top right, we have highlighted where these visual expressions are being foreseen. This is towards the eastern edge, where the outer gardens roll very gently through a series of grasslands and rocks into the water feature. And as one moves towards the northern and the southern edge, it becomes a little bit more structured, where the periphery of the outer garden actually gets defined through a much more formal pathway that helps define the edge of the water. And as one moves towards the western edge, integrating the stepping stones and the islands, the edges start becoming a lot more natural and as a very important space of transition from the outer gardens, which in my head is the larger outer space, if one were to think of it as the more profane landscape, as one moves towards the more sacred landscape, which is the island and the Matrimandir. The visual expression also is very much dependent on the kind of species that are used, which in this case, needless to add, will all be very much indigenous. Indigenous, not just because they're ecologically more sensible, we also want to make sure that all the gardens remain chemical free in the long run without the use of any exotics. A combination of multi-story vegetation, which includes trees, smaller and larger shrubs, grasslands, ground covers, and in some cases, it could also be lawns, which helps define the different qualities of the spaces that abounds around the lake. The idea of the stepping stone, which I mentioned, where even though the bridge that one sees in the plan comes across as a very dominant element, the idea is to treat it in a very subtle manner so that the act of crossing this water is a lot more mindful rather than merely an idea of transportation from one place to another. And the edges, this we saw in the plan, as well as what constitutes the main space of transition from the outer profane edges towards the inner sacred edges. It creates a lot more spaces for quietude and contemplation. Some quick thoughts on the way forward is, other than the technical details that will go into making the lake, we will be very, very mindful of the kind of marine creatures, both flora and fauna, that will need to be integrated to make sure that we create a natural balance with the minimum use of any kind of inputs. This is both to address the biological oxygen demand of the water, as well as the buildup due to other nutrients that results as the chemical oxygen demand. And the actual ways of construction, though I mentioned it briefly, I will repeat this again, is entirely premised on passive technologies and natural materials, with a specific provision for variation in the water depth. So it is not a fixed water depth that will need to be maintained. The idea that there will be variation pre and post monsoon will also mean that the edge conditions of the flora and the fauna will respond accordingly to the varying degrees of wetness that one will find on the edges. Yeah, so I'm going to end with this slide, which is only to repeat this very important fact that if we were to look at the entire landscape and on a east-west axis, the eastern part will definitely be higher, responding to the existing levels. And the extent of the water body, while the inner island will remain fixed at one single level, the outer gardens will vary depending on the existing topographic conditions as well as the existing vegetation.